When someone with avoidant tendencies starts to emotionally detach, it's not something that happens overnight, but when it begins, you can almost feel the air change. It's subtle at first. Conversations that once felt open and warm start to feel colder. You bring something up, and instead of leaning in, they start leaning out. You express how you feel, and instead of acknowledging it or engaging, they give you short answers or change the subject entirely. Where there was once an emotional back and forth, a dialogue of two people sharing, there's now a void that you can't quite fill no matter how much you talk. And it's not that they're busy or distracted, it's that emotionally they're checking out. At this stage, they're no longer interested in understanding your emotions. You may try to explain how certain things made you feel, thinking that clarity will bring you closer again, but what you get back is either defensiveness or dismissal. They'll say things like, "You're overthinking it," or "You're too sensitive," or "They didn't mean it like that." What's happening here is not just invalidation of your feelings, but a deeper unwillingness to engage with the emotional reality of the relationship. Because for someone with avoidant tendencies, emotional accountability feels threatening. Being accountable means recognizing that their actions affect you. It means admitting that their choices may have caused you pain or disappointment. And for someone who fears emotional vulnerability, that recognition feels overwhelming. This is when self-preservation kicks in. They start to withdraw from any situation that requires them to own their part in the emotional dynamic. You'll notice a lack of curiosity. They won't ask how you're feeling or what you need. The idea of showing up emotionally feels too heavy for them. So instead of leaning into it, they avoid it completely. Conversations that once were rich with connection and intimacy now feel transactional. They may still communicate, but the tone is different. It's functional, not emotional. They'll talk about plans, logistics, or mundane daily details, but any attempt to steer the conversation toward emotional intimacy is met with resistance or indifference. One of the most frustrating parts about this stage is the mixed signals, because while they are detaching emotionally, they may still physically be around for a time. They might still show up to events, still text you, still go on dates, but beneath the surface, they're emotionally checked out. This creates a confusing dynamic for you because their presence gives you hope, but their emotional distance makes you feel increasingly alone. And that loneliness becomes even more painful because it's happening in the presence of someone who once made you feel safe and connected. As this detachment grows, you start to notice that even when conflict arises, they no longer have the desire to work through it. Healthy conflict requires emotional engagement. It requires two people who are willing to sit in discomfort together and find a resolution. But for the avoidant, conflict feels like emotional quicksand. Rather than face it, they minimize the issue or avoid the conversation entirely. They might say they don't want to argue, or that it's not a big deal, or that you're making things more complicated than they need to be. This avoidance isn't because they don't care about the relationship on some level. It's because facing emotional responsibility feels too vulnerable for them to handle. They may also start to create emotional narratives that protect them from feeling guilty or responsible. They begin to convince themselves that the problem is your emotionality, your expectations, or your inability to let things go. This is a defense mechanism that helps them distance themselves from the discomfort of accountability. By framing the problem as something you are creating, they can avoid looking inward. It's much easier for them to believe that you're being unreasonable than to face the possibility that their behavior has hurt you. This withdrawal is not just about avoiding difficult conversations. It extends into every part of the emotional connection. They stop celebrating your wins with genuine excitement. They stop offering comfort during your struggles. They stop expressing their own vulnerabilities or sharing their own inner world. The relationship starts to feel one-sided. You're the one initiating connection, you're the one trying to create closeness, and you're the one trying to repair any cracks that appear. Meanwhile, they're slowly pulling further and further back, emotionally insulating themselves from both you and the consequences of their behavior. What makes this stage so damaging is that you start to feel like you're chasing them emotionally. You may find yourself trying harder, over-explaining your feelings, trying to be more understanding, or compromising more than you should in hopes that it will pull them back in. But the more you chase, the more they retreat. and the cycle feeds itself, leaving you emotionally exhausted and more disconnected than ever. The avoidant person, having successfully detached, feels safer in their emotional distance. When an avoidant begins to create distance, it doesn't always start with a grand exit or a dramatic declaration. Often, it begins with small, almost imperceptible shifts that accumulate over time until one day you realize just how far apart you've become. Physical and digital distance isn't just about space in the literal sense. It's a strategy. It's a way for the avoidant person to manage the discomfort of emotional intimacy that has started to feel overwhelming. At first, you might notice a drop in how often they initiate contact. The good morning texts stop arriving as consistently. The check-ins throughout the day start to disappear. What was once a steady rhythm of communication now becomes sporadic and unpredictable. When you reach out, they might respond, but the replies are brief, lacking warmth, and often delayed. The lively conversations you once shared become functional exchanges, as if they are just going through the motions rather than actively engaging. Soon after, the excuses start to pile up. They're busy with work, overwhelmed with personal commitments, or simply need some time alone to decompress. While everyone needs space from time to time, what's happening here is not healthy space. It's avoidance disguised as busyness. They start to pull away from spending quality time together, cancelling plans or becoming non-committal about future arrangements. Suddenly, the weekends you used to spend together turn into solo plans on their end, with vague explanations about why they can't make it work. Then the digital withdrawal deepens. They start to disengage from your online presence. They stop liking your posts, stop commenting, and may even mute your updates altogether. It might feel subtle at first, but the absence is noticeable because you know what their engagement used to look like. They begin to treat your digital world as if it no longer involves them, not because they don't see it, but because they no longer want to be emotionally reminded of the connection they're trying to suppress. This digital distancing serves as another layer of insulation, allowing them to emotionally disconnect without having to confront the full weight of what they're doing. Eventually, for many avoidant individuals, the distancing escalates to cutting off access altogether. They may unfollow, unfriend, or even block you on social media platforms. The act of blocking might feel extreme to you, especially if there hasn't been a major conflict to justify it, but for them, it's a way to create a clean break from the emotional discomfort that any form of connection represents. They aren't just trying to avoid you, they're trying to avoid the feelings that your presence triggers. Because every time they see your photo, your name, your updates, it pulls at a part of them they're trying desperately to suppress. So rather than face those feelings, they sever the connection entirely. Phone calls become almost non-existent. Texts go unanswered for hours or even days. If you confront them about the growing silence, they may give vague reassurances that they're just busy or need some space to think. But the truth is that they're not thinking about how to repair the connection. They're thinking about how to stay as far removed from it as possible. The distance is no longer about solving the relationship's issues, it's about escaping them. They might also start physically removing reminders of the relationship from their personal space. Items you once gave them, photos of the two of you, shared mementos, all slowly disappear. These physical erasures serve the same purpose as digital ones. They allow the avoidant to cleanse their environment of emotional triggers that might force them to confront the depth of their disconnection. In doing so, they reinforce the emotional walls they've been building, making it easier to justify their retreat. In some cases, this distance extends into mutual social circles. They may start avoiding mutual friends or gatherings where there's a chance of running into you. They might make calculated decisions to avoid any space, real or virtual, where they could be reminded of the relationship. Even if mutual friends bring up your name, they change the subject quickly, keeping conversations superficial. The goal here isn't necessarily cruelty, it's self-preservation. For the avoidant, each interaction carries a risk of emotional discomfort they don't feel equipped to handle. What becomes clear is that every layer of distance, whether it's fewer texts, cancelled plans, unfollowing you online, blocking you, removing your presence from their life, or withdrawing from mutual social spaces, isn't random. It's a deliberate attempt to sever emotional ties while avoiding the vulnerability of direct confrontation. This slow erosion of connection allows them to maintain a sense of control over their emotional state without having to engage with the pain, accountability, or complexity that comes with a true conversation about what's really happening. When an avoidant person reaches the stage where they begin rewriting the story of the relationship, what they're doing is far more than just looking back with a different perspective. This rewriting is an emotional defense mechanism, a way of reshaping the past so that it feels smaller, less meaningful, and ultimately easier for them to walk away from. In the beginning, the relationship likely carried weight for both of you. There were shared moments, emotional intimacy, and experiences that built a sense of connection. You both invested time, trust, and vulnerability. But when the avoidant starts to feel threatened by the emotional depth and the possibility of having to confront their role in the breakdown, they instinctively begin to recast the entire relationship in a way that minimizes its importance. It usually starts subtly. You might hear them downplay the intensity of what you both shared. Where once they spoke of how special your bond was, now they make casual comments suggesting it wasn't that serious. They might say that things weren't as intense as they seemed, or that it was never really going to work out from the start. This shift can feel jarring, especially when you remember how differently they once spoke about the connection. The avoidant doesn't do this because they didn't feel anything. In fact, it's often because they did feel something and now need to diminish those feelings to avoid facing the vulnerability that accompanied them. They may start reframing moments of happiness as moments of obligation, where once they remembered how much fun they had with you on a trip, now they recall how stressful it was, how much effort it took, or how they were just going along with things to make you happy. Positive memories are reinterpreted through a lens of burden or emotional fatigue. This reframing allows them to create a narrative where they were never fully invested, which helps them justify the disconnection they are now enforcing. If they convince themselves that the relationship wasn't that meaningful, then they don't have to feel guilty about walking away from it. The rewriting also extends to conflict. Any disagreements or rough patches you experienced are now exaggerated to paint a picture of fundamental incompatibility. Instead of seeing arguments as natural moments that happen in any close relationship, they describe them as constant, toxic, or insurmountable. Even isolated issues become defining features of the relationship in their retelling. This exaggerated focus on the negative helps them convince themselves that ending things was not only necessary but inevitable. It absolves them of the responsibility to reflect on how they contributed to those conflicts or what could have been done differently. Another layer of this rewriting involves how they perceive and portray your emotional needs. Where once your vulnerability and openness may have been received with affection, now they are reframed as emotional pressure or neediness. They may describe you to others, or even to themselves, as someone who was too demanding or who expected too much from them. By casting your genuine expressions of love, concern, or insecurity as unreasonable expectations, they distance themselves from having to engage with their own fear of emotional closeness. It's not that your needs changed, it's that their tolerance for intimacy became overwhelmed, and now they need to justify that overwhelm by making you appear too intense. In conversations with mutual friends or new people they meet, the avoidant may present the relationship as something that simply didn't fit. They'll use phrases that sound mature on the surface, talking about differences in values or timing, but underneath, these statements serve to sanitize their exit. They make it seem like the ending was mutual or unavoidable, when in reality, they are rewriting the narrative to avoid facing their emotional discomfort. This version of the story allows them to present themselves as rational and unaffected, even if the truth is far more complicated. Sometimes they even rewrite their own behavior. Actions that caused hurt or confusion are reframed as reasonable responses to your behavior. They might say they withdrew because they were reacting to your emotions, making it seem as though they were simply protecting themselves rather than avoiding emotional accountability. This retelling allows them to maintain their self-image as someone who acted out of self-preservation, not avoidance or fear. The more they repeat this revised version of events, the more they start to believe it themselves. It becomes the narrative they hold on to, not just for the benefit of others, but for their own peace of mind. Rewriting the story helps them avoid the painful introspection that would require them to confront their own fears, insecurities, and patterns. It allows them to distance themselves emotionally while feeling justified in their decision to disconnect. When an avoidant person moves into the stage of actively seeking new connections, what you're witnessing is not just the natural course of moving on. This stage serves a very particular purpose for someone who struggles with emotional intimacy. The avoidant isn't necessarily ready to face the emotional consequences of their withdrawal, so instead, they shift their focus onto new people, new experiences, and new distractions that allow them to bypass that internal work. These new connections often serve as a buffer between them and the emotional discomfort they're trying to avoid. Rather than sitting with the emptiness that follows detachment, they fill that space quickly with others who represent a kind of emotional reset. New people bring novelty, fresh attention, and an illusion of lightness that contrasts sharply with the emotional intensity they felt in the previous relationship. In these early stages, the avoidant can enjoy the surface-level excitement of getting to know someone new without the vulnerability that comes with true intimacy. They might suddenly become highly social, reconnecting with old friends they had previously distanced themselves from, or throwing themselves into work colleagues, group activities, or hobbies that keep them constantly surrounded by others. This surge of social energy isn't necessarily about deepening these new relationships, but about staying distracted enough to avoid self-reflection. By keeping their schedules full, they reduce the moments of stillness that might otherwise force them to confront any lingering guilt, sadness, or regret. Every social interaction becomes a form of emotional insulation, padding them from the deeper feelings they're not ready to face. In many cases, these new connections also extend into romantic or flirtatious territory. For the avoidant, entering into a new romantic dynamic allows them to recapture the excitement of early connection without the emotional risks they perceive in established intimacy. In the beginning, new relationships don't require the kind of emotional vulnerability that long-term relationships demand. They're filled with light, fun, and minimal responsibility. The avoidant can present their best self without having to reveal the insecurities and fears that caused them to withdraw from their previous relationship. This fresh start offers them a sense of control, a chance to re-experience closeness without the heaviness they associate with emotional depth. Often, these new romantic pursuits aren't necessarily about finding someone better or more compatible. They're about emotional displacement. The avoidant isn't resolving the underlying reasons they detached. They're simply redirecting their focus onto someone new. This creates the illusion that they've moved on, but in reality, they're carrying the same emotional patterns into a new dynamic. The problem isn't the person they left behind. It's the avoidant's own discomfort with vulnerability, which remains unresolved. By quickly replacing intimacy with someone else, they avoid the emotional accountability that would come from addressing their part in the previous relationship's breakdown. You might observe that in these new relationships, the avoidant seems unusually eager to present everything as easy, effortless, and drama-free. They want to convince themselves that the complications of the previous relationship were unique, that the issues were about the dynamic rather than their own avoidance of intimacy. This creates a narrative where they can continue to believe they are open to love and connection, while still avoiding any true emotional work. The ease of new beginnings allows them to maintain the illusion that they are capable of healthy relationships without being forced to address why deeper connections trigger their fears in the first place. Even if they don't jump into a full-fledged relationship, they may still seek out flirtations, casual encounters, or online dating as a way to keep their emotional focus directed outward. These small bursts of validation give them temporary relief from any discomfort or emptiness they might feel. Every new conversation, every swipe, every flirtatious exchange serves as a small hit of reassurance that they are still desirable, still in control, and still far away from the vulnerability that intimacy requires. They build a layer of surface-level connection that shields them from looking inward. At the same time, you may notice that they seem almost indifferent to the emotional aftermath of the previous relationship. While you may be processing, grieving, and reflecting, they appear unbothered, happily moving forward with new people and new experiences. This indifference isn't always genuine. Often it's the product of this very displacement. Their attention is so focused on the external that they don't allow themselves the space to feel the internal. Avoiding emotional pain doesn't mean it isn't there. It just means they've become skilled at numbing it through distraction. This pattern can sometimes repeat for avoidant individuals, as each new connection eventually reaches a point where intimacy deepens and the same fears resurface. There comes a point where the avoidant no longer just pulls away or rewrites the story, but shifts into complete indifference. This indifference is not simply coldness or cruelty, it's a deliberate shutting down of emotional engagement. When they reach this stage, it becomes painfully clear that they are no longer interested in how their actions have affected you. It's not that they don't intellectually understand that you might be hurting, but emotionally, they detach from any responsibility or involvement in your healing. They create a distance so profound that it feels as though your emotions no longer register for them. The person who once listened to your fears, who comforted you during difficult moments, now behaves as though those moments never existed. They no longer inquire about your well-being. They no longer show any interest in where you are emotionally or how you're coping. Even if you reach out to express your pain or ask for clarity, you're often met with silence, avoidance, or a polite but detached response that offers no real comfort or resolution. This absence of empathy is one of the most painful stages for the person left behind because it feels as though your shared history has been erased. The avoidant's indifference allows them to sidestep the uncomfortable reality that someone else is suffering as a result of their choices. Facing that pain would require them to confront their own role in creating it, and for many avoidants, that kind of accountability feels too threatening. Instead, they adopt a mindset that separates them emotionally from the consequences of their actions. In this state, even the idea of closure becomes irrelevant to them. Where you may feel the need to have one final conversation, to seek understanding or mutual respect in parting ways, the avoidant sees no value in this. Closure requires vulnerability, acknowledgement of shared emotions, and an honest reflection on what happened. But for the avoidant, that level of emotional exposure is precisely what they have been trying to avoid all along. Often they rationalize this indifference by convincing themselves that reaching out would only make things worse or reopen wounds that should be left alone. They may even frame it as an act of kindness, telling themselves that giving you space is what you need, even if it's clear that the real reason is their own discomfort with emotional confrontation. This rationalization serves to protect their self-image while avoiding the work of true empathy. In some cases, they may appear outwardly cordial if circumstances force an interaction, but the tone is flat, transactional, and emotionally distant. They'll talk to you the way they would talk to a distant acquaintance rather than someone with whom they shared deep intimacy. This emotional flatness is their armor. It allows them to engage on the surface while keeping their deeper emotions completely walled off. Even if you express your need for validation, understanding, or even just a small acknowledgement of the pain you're experiencing, they often either deflect or offer hollow reassurances that lack any real depth. They might say things like they wish you the best or that they hope you find happiness, but these words feel empty because they come without genuine emotional engagement. What you're left with is not just the loss of the relationship, but the painful realization that the person who once seemed to care deeply is now emotionally absent from your healing process. You may watch them move on with their life as if nothing significant happened. They carry on with work, friends, or even new relationships, showing no visible signs of reflection or grief. This outward appearance of ease can make you question the reality of what you shared, as though the entire relationship was more meaningful to you than it ever was to them. But in reality, this lack of emotional processing is not a reflection of the relationship's significance, but of their inability to sit with emotional discomfort. In their world, detaching fully from your emotions feels safer than facing the complexity of what was lost. They avoid empathy because empathy opens the door to guilt, to the acknowledgement that their choices have left someone else in pain. And for someone with an avoidant attachment style, guilt is a deeply destabilizing feeling that threatens their fragile sense of emotional control. By remaining indifferent, they protect themselves from these emotions, but in doing so, they also sever any remaining threads of connection.